Dear panelists, dear guests, thank you so much for being here tonight. Good evening, I'm Frédéric Jung, I'm the Consul General of France in San Francisco. I was told that this beautiful venue hasn't been used actually for the past 2 years, so I think it's great news that we are actually in a way re-inaugurating it. With a panel dedicated to such an important issue as biodiversity. With this program, the French Ameri-Can Climate Talks on Biodiversity, Fact B. So, of course, we just had a little chat with a panelist earlier. Coming from France, biodiversity doesn't seem to be so much of an issue here in San Francisco, I have to say. When I'm coming back at night to my residence and I have a coyote running in front of me or a raccoon. But in fact, I believe, and this is an experience you do not have in Paris, in the streets of Paris. But unfortunately, I suspect that this personal experience of wilderness here in San Francisco is not really reflecting the reality of the evolution of biodiversity in the US, just like in Europe. Indeed, IPBES has recently estimated, you know it, that no less than 1 million animals and plant species are threatened with extinction due to human activity. And this biological collapse would obviously be a disaster for all those who rely on such ecosystems. This is why France, as well as the US, have committed to making by 2030, only 8 years from now, 30% of their land and of their water areas protected areas. And such protected areas can take different forms, national parks, natural reserves, in order to contribute to fighting against disintegration of biodiversity. As we're speaking, actually, and to ramp up the efforts made to fight against the reduction of biodiversity, France has unveiled just yesterday a strategy, a national strategy for biodiversity, which has been presented by the minister in charge of this issue. The strategy comprises of 5 pillars, 72 measures, to put an end to the decline of the fauna and the flora. First measure, no, I won't list the 72, but I just want to highlight that this is really something that France is focusing on, and which, by the way, will be amplified because this is only a first version of a strategy, and the government wants to be more ambitious, and so that's why we will add to this strategy more objectives and more targets to be more effective, especially in view of the COP15 on biodiversity, which will be held in the fall in China, I believe. And so the objective is not only to list good intentions, but really to actually take decisive action. And one of our main challenges is the constant expansion of cities, obviously, which are a threat to biodiversity and really rethinking the way we shape cities and we do urban planning to take into account the issue of biodiversity. So I'm very glad that the French government has waited for this meeting to take place to present the strategy. But it really tells a lot about how timely this meeting is today. These Fact B series have been launched in 2019, but they had to be suspended, obviously, in the past 2 years. And I'm glad we're now finally able to resume these discussions. This year's cycle consists of a series of 3 high-level conversations at the cross-section of conservation and protection policies for natural areas in the US, in France, and in Canada as well, because Canada is one of the points where this will be discussed later on. The goal of Fact B is twofold: raise awareness amongst the public and decision makers about biodiversity issues and policies in France, the US, and Canada. And the second objective is allow to reinforce exchanges between scientists, policy experts, amongst you, in order to provide a public forum for discussion. Fact B is part of a broader effort of France to make biodiversity conservation a priority at the international level in the same way as we do and we're known for in terms of climate more generally. This is why I would like to thank all those who have been participating to this endeavor today, the French and American speakers who are with us today. Thank you so much for being here, as well as to the moderator. And I want to thank David Ackerley, who is the Dean of the College of Natural Resources at UC Berkeley and who has, I believe, provided many contacts in order to prepare this session. Autodesk, of course, for providing in particular this beautiful space today. And last but not least, the team of the Science and Technology Department of the Consulate of France. They did a tremendous job in organizing this. And I really want to thank Jean-Baptiste and his team for all this work to allow this discussion today. So I wish you all a very pleasant and animated debate today on this highly important topic. Thank you so much. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Great. I feel very short here. My name is Zoe Bespalco. I'm a sustainability strategy manager here at Autodesk, and I'm just really happy to host you tonight for this event. And I just wanted to give you just a couple of words of why you're here at Autodesk and why sustainability is so important to our work. And just to give you a little bit of a holistic approach of how we do sustainability at Autodesk. We obviously work on our own operation around, improving our business practices, engaging our employee into pro bono. We are net zero since 2020, and we have objectives of 50% of carbon scope 1 and 2 carbon reductions by 2030. But I think really the biggest opportunity that we have is in partnering with our customers. And really, I invite you to go into our gallery after and see the work that our customers are doing with our technology. And we really think that we can enable them in reducing their environmental impact and reaching their sustainability goals. We work in major industry like architecture, engineering, and construction, design and manufacturing with automotive, industrial machinery, and so forth. And these are major contributors to climate change. Just the building environment, the operation and construction of building represent about 40% of carbon emission globally. And we really have an impact to partner with our customers on helping them design buildings that are more energy efficient or that uses material with lower carbon intensity materials. We also work specifically through the work of the Autodesk Foundation, but also through our governmental affair group into really advancing our industries with policy and cross-sector collaboration and really catalyzing innovation with investment in kind of in between and beyond our traditional Autodesk market with the work that the Autodesk Foundation is doing. So overall, we have a very holistic approach. I think this is the reason why we are supporting this conversation and having you today. We have some tools today that help planners with infrastructure that can integrate into GIS data and really think about land management differently. So I'm very excited to hear what the conversation has to say. And thank you again for all together working on making, a kind of a net zero future here. So thank you so much.
There are only 3 welcomes tonight, so I am the 3rd. I'm David Ackerley, Dean of Rausser College of Natural Resources at UC Berkeley. And on behalf of University of California, I want to welcome everyone who's here, everyone who's online. I want to extend my thanks to the French Consulate for the invitation to co-sponsor tonight's event. This is a great pleasure and part of a continuing series, which we've participated in before. I will only add to the framing of what's already been introduced is the biodiversity crisis has to be understood in relation to the climate crisis and also to the challenges of equity and inequality that impact every sector of the world, both among and within societies. And California's commitment to achieving 30% conservation is one part of a multifaceted strategy, which is also committed to actions that enhance climate resilience on our natural and working lands, enhance their role in climate solutions, especially carbon sequestration and other ecosystem functions, and advance equitable access to nature and a more general move, the commitments to enhancing equity in our society. And so California's approach embraces all three, and I hope that we will hear more about that tonight. So without further ado, I will introduce John Jarvis, the moderator tonight. John started as a ranger in the National Park System, U.S. National Park System in 1976, has played just about every role in the service up to and including being director of the National Park Service under President Obama. He then came and served as the inaugural director of the Institute for Parks, People, and Biodiversity at the University of California, Berkeley, and now serves as the chair of the advisory board for our institute and as a senior advisor to all of us who share this commitment to the protection of open space and parklands. And John will moderate the event.
Thank you, David. Yeah, you go from young whippersnapper to old sage in a flash, and that's where I am today. So what we're going to do is I'm going to pose a few questions to our panel. I'm going to have them introduce themselves. Then I have a few questions, and we're going to have a discussion with the panel. But we want to invite your questions as well, and those that are watching via the live stream as well. So we will reserve some time, a little more towards the end, to bring in questions. If those of you that are out there, you have a question specifically for one of the panel members, please let us know that. We're monitoring that on the chat room, and those will be delivered to the panel for their answering. So I would like the panel to introduce themselves. That's probably the best way to do it, and we'll start right here on the end with Jennifer Norris. It should be live.
There we go. We didn't test these while we were chit-chatting. Well, hi, my name is Jennifer Norris. I serve as the Deputy Secretary for Biodiversity and Habitat at the California Natural Resources Agency. We're the agency that oversees our national parks, protects biodiversity. We have boards and conservancies that are responsible for land management throughout the state. And I work on biodiversity and habitat sort of broadly across the state, and I lead our 30 by 30 effort.
Hi, I am Suble. I am the director of the French Foundation for Biodiversity Research. And the foundation has three main goals. The first one is to finance some research. The second one is to put together researchers and stakeholders in order to make them talk about their issues and the way to transform those issues into scientific questions and perhaps research project. And then the third goal of the foundation is to communicate about research results, the results of the French researcher, of course, but also the results of the international community of researchers on ecology, but not only. We as well try to communicate about the result of research of economists and sociologists, because biodiversity is a broad question, a broad issue that regards everyone.
Hi, I'm Holly Dermus. I teach at the law school at UC Berkeley, where I specialize in environmental and natural resources law, and I'm a co-faculty director of the Institute for Parks, People, and Biodiversity at Berkeley. And my research interests for a long time have included biodiversity protection. And since I'm working in California, they also include water law and policy, which you have to deal with if you want to do biodiversity protection in California in an effective way. And also the role of science in environmental policy making and implementation, and how to make effective, appropriate, and appropriately limited use of science in that context.
Hello, I'm Cyril Barnerias. I'm head of European and International Relations, French Biodiversity Agency. We are based in Paris or close to Paris, and I will go back later to what my agency does.
Okay, thank you. Great panel, great to start. So I'm going to start sort of local, like California. And I'm going to start with Jennifer Norris, the Deputy Secretary. And Jennifer, maybe you could tell us, since you're leading this effort, what's been your approach to achieving biodiversity conservation climate resilience and equitable access to nature all at once in the next decade leading up to 2030. And how are we doing?
That's a really short question. Thanks, John. Well, I will say that this initiative started with an executive order that was issued by our governor that said we really need to elevate biodiversity protection as a statewide priority and focus on using our natural and working lands in the fight against climate change. You know, California has some really forward-thinking initiatives. You know, we're going for zero emission vehicles by, I think, 2035. We're not going to sell any gas combustion, cars. We've got our carbon trading. There's all sorts of technological approaches to climate change, but we haven't really worked hard to bring the natural and working land sector into our efforts. So broadly speaking, the executive order started with that. But as part of that, we committed to protecting 30% of our lands and coastal waters by 2030 and joined this high ambition coalition across the globe. And as part of that executive order, we were directed to make sure we're protecting biodiversity, but also using our lands to address climate change, and then fundamentally making sure we expand access to nature in an equitable way. So how do we do that? That's the question. And we spent a year doing outreach. We had 17 different workshops on Zoom, which wasn't great, but we had over 4,000 people participate in those, some for 4 or 5 hours at a time. And it was really wonderful. What we approached it as asking people, what is working? How is conservation effectively done in California? What are the ways that we can get this done together? And we pulled all that information together and we put out what we think is a strategic document that outlines all the different ways we can approach conservation and all the ways we can work together. And to answer your question, right now, we think we're at 24% of our lands are currently in a highly protected status and 16% of our coastal waters.
Very good. Cyril, could you tell us maybe how France is approaching this sort of same set of objectives and maybe contrast a little bit between what's similar and what's different in France?
Okay. So in addition to the national strategy for biodiversity that was mentioned before, France also issued a national strategy for protected areas to reach that objective of 30% in 2030. And we reach already 33% on marine areas and 31% on terrestrial areas of protected areas. So one could say that we did the job, but of course not, because the strategy has different objectives, and two of them go back to what you said. The first one is to develop a network of protected areas that would be resilient to climate change. So that's something important, of course. And the second one is the integration of protected areas in their territories, which would be one of the main target of this strategy. So that's the thing we are going to work until 2030 to better integrate protected areas in their territories.
Okay. Holly, I know you've been involved nationally, or at least talking to people that are involved nationally. So we started with California, which we think is at 24% terrestrially. What about, President Biden has made a commitment to this as well. How do you think that we're doing nationally on this effort?
Well, how are we doing nationally depends on what it is we're trying to do, right? And 30 by 30 is an amazing, and it's been an amazingly successful rhetorical tool, right? It really gets people's attention. Let's protect 30% of our lands and waters by a date certain. And it's a tangible kind of goal, except it's not really. What does it mean to be protected? And in the United States, we have quite a high proportion of our land mass that is owned by the federal government. And in California, we have an even higher proportion of our land mass that's owned by the federal government because the Western states are especially rich in federal lands. And most of those federally owned lands have some level of conservation or recreation, public use type of purpose. But what's enough to qualify as conserved and how we measure that, we don't know. We've never had any real clue about that. California, to its credit, is trying to define levels of protection and what that means. So far, the US effort has been really, really vague. And part of the context here that I think is important in the US is that at the national level and heavily also at the state level, this is being done by executive orders and executive branch initiatives, not by legislation. That at the national level, I think there's no way around that right now, given our polarization and inability to get legislation done. But that does raise, that means we're missing that opportunity to clarify goals and to prioritize among goals, and we're missing that kind of national conversation. Now, I should also say, we've always had multiple conservation goals. We've never, ever, ever in this country defined a single conservation goal. As John surely knows, we have even our national parks, which are our most important, most strongly conserved areas, have multiple goals and always have. So that's not necessarily in and of itself a problem. But I think we do need to define our goals with some degree of clarity more than bean counting acres protected.
That's great. Spot on, I think, from Helen. One of the efforts that really Deputy Secretary Norris has sort of challenged us at the academic community here, and particularly with David Ackerley's leadership, is what are the research gaps? What's our knowledge gaps to achieve 30 by 30? And perhaps you could speak to how you are approaching that in France, helping you understand and develop essentially a research agenda that can help us achieve these goals with good science as a foundation.
Yes, perhaps I would add that Oli already said that the level of protection is a very huge question, which is which has been already answered by some of scientific papers. For example, in the marine protected areas, some researchers proposed sort of guidance in order to qualify the level of protection, but there is a lot of works to be done on this matter, because the level of protection is not quite rely to the level of efficiency of the marine protected areas, and we can say that. We already know that when a protected area is fully protected, it is very well efficient. But when the protected area allows some human activities, such as fisheries or mining or even recreational activities, it can be a bit more tricky. But we haven't any clue today to say if at what level it is efficient or not. So that is a research question. Perhaps the other one would be to understand where do we have to put a protected area, because it's not a simple question. Some researchers speak about ecological efficiency. That is to say, an area where, for example, there is a great diversity of animals or plants, speaking of terrestrial areas, or marine mammals or birds, seabirds, for marine protected areas. And most of the time, we don't really know if the designed protected area, the current protected area, are placed in the sea or in the land. And I think we will need more research to really understand what that means. Another question, perhaps, it's what is the integrity of an ecosystem? What is an ecosystem very well functioning? We don't really know how to measure that, how to measure the integrity or the function of an ecosystem. We have some clue, for example, when speaking about ecosystem services. We know that the more the ecosystem is fully integrated, the more you can have some ecosystem services for human being. But it's not very clear, and we will need some more research on that matter as well.
Okay, very good, great. I'm going to toss out this question to anyone or all of you, but what counts? You know, that we have these numeric goals, 30% by 30. So what's in, what's out? And you've touched on it a little bit, but I'd like you to talk about what are the metrics that you would use to determine what counts towards the goal, what does not.
I'll go first. I'll jump in. So
I know you've thought about this.
a little bit. So we really grappled with this because, first of all, as others have pointed out, there's a lot of conservation that happens, broadly speaking, across all kinds of landscapes. And 30 by 30 is really a special case of conservation. It doesn't represent all conservation, but because it's so catchy, everybody wants to be part of it, and everybody wants to be labeled 30 by 30. But if everything counts, then nothing counts. So you do have to draw some lines. And so what we proposed is sort of two parts. There needs to be durable protection, so a place that is in good condition now, we want to see it that way in the future. And it needs to be protected fundamentally for biodiversity. The other objectives are important, but they can't trump biodiversity. So I think there was an article in the New York Times recently about nature-based solutions, planting trees to sequester carbon, right? People are nodding. Just planting trees in places where trees don't belong, that might be a great carbon solution, but that's not protecting our biodiversity and that's not protecting natural systems. So we want to find places where biodiversity protection is durable, and these other benefits are also there, but nature sort of at the core.
Well, I can jump in a little bit. It's very difficult to measure exactly how protected is a place, especially if among our goals are access, right? So we don't want to protect places by just walling them off. And I think both California and the United States have been clear that that's been something that's been done in the past, and it's not the way to go for the future. But that means we need measures. And this is one of the things that's going to be important about how these areas are governed, right? Is we need measures of, Jen just said the most important goal in California that takes priority is biodiversity. Well, we've never been all that good at measuring biodiversity, to be honest. And Ellen talked about ecosystem integrity and how difficult that is to define. That's difficult to define even if you're not in a highly dynamic, rapidly changing world. And so that's another layer of complexity. And I don't pretend to have the easy answers here, but obviously those are questions that are going to have to be grappled with. The other thing I would say is there have been some measures out there in the United States of how protected are different lands. The USGS, for example, has categorization of, really strong, I forget exactly what their labels are.
They're gap codes, 1 through 4.
Right, 1 to 4, highly protected to not protected at all. Well, they put, I think, all multiple use national lands in the not enough protected category, but that may not be right. I mean, all our national forests are multiple use lands, but they all have, or they're supposed to have, plans that within the national forest divide them up into different pieces, some of which are more strongly protected than others. But the other place that it's going to be really hard to define this is both nationally and in California, there's a commitment to bringing working lands into this and to having lands that are privately owned, being used for economic purposes, but also providing some conservation. And exactly how we're going to measure and categorize and make sure that's durable is going to be tough. If we just say conservation easements will do it, nope. We have enough history of conservation easements to say just having conservation easements is not enough. They've got to define a little bit more what will be done and what won't be done, and they have to be enforceable in a way that is credible and robust and practical.
Maybe just to complement on that, one other set of criteria that could be used could be maybe the list of IUCN, so International Union for the Conservation of Nature, list of type of protected areas could be also a solution to design that.
And perhaps I could add that I think one of the most important things, perhaps, it's the ability of this protected area to adapt to a changing world, as you said, because with the climate change, we know that we must allow biodiversity to evolve and to adapt to these changing conditions. And this will be possible probably for most of the biodiversity, but there is a great concern into the scientific community, for example, for the biggest animals or plants, because their needs are different from, for example, bacteria in the soil, and they will need, for example, space. And unfortunately, with the human encroachment in the ecosystem, some of them lack of space. And perhaps one of the response to that would be the connectivity between protected areas in terrestrial areas and in marine protected areas. But indeed, it's difficult to be happy with the protected areas right now. But it's difficult as well to say that this goal isn't a sort of target that we need to enforce, because it's the first step perhaps for something stronger. Because one of my questions would be, okay, we are protecting 30% of the land, 30% of the ocean, but what for the 70% left? Are we going to destroy every biodiversity that stands there or not? So I think the question is larger than only what are we going to do with these 30% of protected areas?
That's a very good, and that is actually one of the questions I'm going to get to, is like, what if the initiative was let's develop 70% of the planet? Then that would be a problem, I think. I want to talk a little bit about how this 30 by 30 effort is a little different, particularly here in California, in that equity and the issues, the legacy issues that we have here, particularly in the United States, about displacement, disenfranchisement, removal, and the inequities that we have in communities of color, in particular, with access to nature. And this was, I think, particularly honed for a lot of us during the COVID pandemic, where people wanted to get back outside. It was one of the safest places to go to get back to nature. And yet we know that there are great inequities in that availability, particularly nature near home, which can be contributors to biodiversity and to this overarching initiative. So with that sort of in mind, how are you, and this is again open to the full panel, feeling that we should approach this time with this conservation effort? Because conservation efforts in the past, the creation of the national park system, for instance, resulted because indigenous people had been removed, sometimes forcibly, from these lands This one needs to be different. And this one needs to put equity and access and inequality as the forefront. So, and I'm sure France has some insights into that as well. So we'll start with Jen, though.
Sure.
Sure.
So obviously this is a big part of what we're thinking about. And one thing that's clear that we need to keep in mind, I think, is that access is more than equity and equity is more than access. Like they're not exactly the same and we kind of use them interchangeably, right? But equity means having people at the table for all parts of the decision making. It's not just about bringing access to a place. It's about how you're planning conservation, how you're making regional decisions about where to go next. It's about the other 70%. So that's a bigger umbrella. But within 30 by 30, the focus that I'm interested in is how can we invest more in bringing nature closer to people that haven't had it in the past, that have been excluded. But I'm going to give a shout out to my colleague, Catherine Toy, who's here, which another key initiative of the Resources Agency is expanding access more broadly. So it's more than just place. It's more than just having a place to go. It's making sure those places are welcoming, that people can get to them, and I won't speak for Catherine and all the different things she's working on, but she's just launching another year-long effort to really dig into how do we address those issues of making the places that we protect accessible to all, because both of those things have to happen. But within 30 by 30, we want to prioritize if there's restoration, there's lots of opportunity to restore ecosystems that we need to restore that are in the places we don't traditionally think of. In California, we've got a lot of snow and ice that is protected. We don't have a lot of wetlands in LA, you know, and there's work to do. So that's where we want to focus a lot of our attention.
Yeah, maybe two things. First, from France, we passed a new law in 2006 to have more integration of local communities in the governance of protected areas, and I think we still have some way to go in that direction. But that was first step, and especially for national parks, for example. Before it was real top-down governance, and now it's a little bit more inclusive. But it's, still a long way to go, I think. And that also goes back to the question of, to the difficulties that we will face if we want to have more inclusive protected areas. It means also that we need more consultation before setting protected areas. So it will take more time. And so it's really a different process that we have to engage in. And maybe regarding equity, it's another example. So not from France, but we visited the Presidio National Park this morning, and I must say that I was really impressed by the work that is being done there to have more people from poor communities, for example, and from color communities coming to the national park and have an initiation to nature, to biodiversity. Because sometimes it's their only way to have a touch with nature. So I was really impressed by this program. I don't know if it's general, but I must testimony that it's really impressive.
Sure.
Holly?
Yeah, 30 by 30 doesn't have to be everything. Right. And there's some things that it may not be the best vehicle for. If the key goal of 30 by 30 is biodiversity, then it may not be the best vehicle for local nature protection, small places in local communities. My own view is that that's essential. That's essential from an equity point of view, but it's also essential if you think conservation is a long-term goal, and I do. The only way conservation remains a goal over the long term is if people care. And the only way that people care is if they have some contact with nature and natural areas and it means something in their life. So I think it's crucial for conservation in general to have local access. It's crucial for equity and inclusion of everybody, that everybody in our community have some access and opportunity and guidance to connecting with nature, but that doesn't necessarily have to come from 30 by 30.
In February, we launched a survey about the way that people were facing the two words, nature or biodiversity in France, to see what is their preference. And the survey shows that poor people, so the very low-income population, prefer the word nature. And I would say that this is perhaps because they don't really know lots about biodiversity, and perhaps this is the problem, because indeed education is very important in order to make people understand that biodiversity is essential for them, for the community, for the humanity. And perhaps this question should be raised, but I agree, probably not in the 30 by 30 initiative, perhaps in other context, and perhaps we should all think about that, because access to green space, or access to national parks, or access to biodiversity is very important. And we work with scientists who deals with health. And the health, you know, is very related to biodiversity. And the very interesting point, it's now we have more and more scientific paper, who talks about microbiome and human microbiome. And it is now well known that poor population in the cities are a less diverse microbiome than rich population, because they don't have the same access to nature and to biodiversity. First of all, in the park, in the city park, urban parks, especially in the big towns. But also because they don't have enough money to go in vacation very far away, for example, in the mountains or in the sea, and they stay at home, they stay in town, and this led to some difficulties in health for them, including mental health. So it's very important. It's very important to focus on these questions, to perhaps understand what is at stake when we are speaking about biodiversity and access to biodiversity.
Could I just say one more thing? I think it's important that we not be nature snobs. And elite, highly educated scientists, policymakers of all stripes sometimes have a tendency to be nature snobs and to think the only things that count as nature are very large, very wild areas. And as John pointed out, some of those were created by taking people out of the picture, deliberately created in that way. But nature can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people, and we should have room for that in our policy space.
I couldn't agree more. And I think that it brings us back to that question of the other 70%. And I know this is another one that we've all thought a lot about, but clearly biodiversity can't be the answer to all of these questions. I mean, the 30%. Something else has to occur on the other 70%. And that's priorities around landscape level connectivity, around working landscapes, around buffer strips, around conservation measures for watersheds, all of those kinds of things. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that, both in the US and in France, about how you think about the other 70% of your land base and water. Go ahead, Cyril.
So yeah, we try to, so two things. First, we try to make what we call spatial planning on the 100% of the territory. So it means that normally local government have the duty to map their uses of their territory, taking into account biodiversity. So that's one first thing. And the second thing also and that's one of our mission of my agency, is to raise awareness regarding biodiversity with local governments first, and also companies, to help them understand that their activity depends on biodiversity and how it depends on biodiversity. So that's one of our actions, to make them understand how it is important for them also to protect biodiversity.
I think the protection of the biodiversity could be understood in two ways. The first way would be to protect and conserve biodiversity and restore biodiversity where it is important. And the second way to protect biodiversity is to use biodiversity in a sustainable way. And as Cyril say, it is very important that all activities think about their impact on biodiversity, impact on nature, and then try to change their pathways. And it is the second goal of the Convention on biological diversity, sorry. And I think it's also a very important goal. So the sustainable use. How will the company do that? It's not an easy question to answer. And I think we will need a lot of talk between scientists and stakeholders and decision makers, public decision makers and private decision makers, because there are some solutions. For example, what we call nature-based solution can be used to transform our economy, our way to do things, our way to use nature. And perhaps the second thing that is important is to think about our society and the way that our entire economy is based on the destruction of biodiversity. When you own a land or forest, if you want to make money, you have to cut the trees and to sell the wood. But if you want to protect your forest, you will have to pay for that. So the economy is not, for now, structure in a way to protect biodiversity. But there is some solution. There is some win-win solution to protect biodiversity and make money with it. And a lot of study show that, in fact, when you protect biodiversity, you create some other opportunities, which can be economic opportunities, as well as opportunity for health, for example, or for mitigate the climate change, or for regulate extreme events, etc. And most of the time, when you protect biodiversity, you create opportunity for tourism, for example, or opportunity for restoration, and you can make money with the protection of biodiversity. So I think it is well understood now in France, because we are talking very much with stakeholders and some private companies, and I think they want to find solution to do that properly. And it is very optimistic to say that we are together in the same boat, and the people are willing to do in the same direction. Sometimes they don't know how to do that. That's all.
That's very good. Annette?
I mean, almost everything's been said, but I'll just add, you know, within California, I mentioned at the beginning that we had this executive order that's much broader than 30 by 30. And a lot of the investments that are part of that executive order are about these other not 30 by 30 pieces, which are, you know, pollinators, healthy soils, investing in nature-based solutions writ large. And I think it's really important to think about how our 30 by 30 protected areas, which are sort of this higher level of protection, they exist in this matrix of all these other activities. And it's important that those protections exist. We affectionately call these lands friends of 30 by 30 on our own. But it's part of, it's part of the matrix, and it's essential. You can't just have a protected area surrounded by concrete. That's not going to work either. So, and I think, the United States has been doing this a long time. Our national parks are all surrounded by national forests with that in mind, right? That's the transition zone to the how well we're doing. We can talk about that, but at least that was the vision. So,
Just really quickly, this is so obvious that it hasn't been said. I don't think anybody up here doubts it. The most important conservation measures we can take right now are reducing carbon emissions, right? So it's not just what we do on those other lands, it's how we do it. And the other thing I would mention is that we're not talking about water here nearly enough. And you can't protect water and water aquatic ecosystems in the same ways. You can't set aside protected areas of the streams in the same ways, because people taking water out above, putting other things in, and we need to worry a lot. In California in particular, we people need to take less water out of those streams if we want to protect our biodiversity. And ourselves. Yes. Yeah, both. Our cities need water too.
Yeah, that water always is a challenge in that it's not where you are, but it's what you're doing with it and who's doing it. And it is very diverse in terms of its regulatory framework. And I know, Holly, you've been a real leader in helping us reframe that. I think we want to take some questions from our two audiences now, one in present here. And if I could ask maybe somebody, a runner, to come up and grab a mic to walk around. Do we have anybody that's willing to do that? Here we go. Yeah, and so just stick up your hand if you have a question for one of the panelists, and if you can direct it to. No, they control it back there. Oh, you used the button. Okay.
She's reducing carbon emissions.
Hello. Yeah. So there is a question from Alicia in the chat. There is a misconception that the protected areas database status 4 category is the same as not protected. In fact, one definition of status 4 is management unknown. There is a lot of land in status 4 that might actually be very biodiverse. Given this, what are the panelists' thoughts on using modeled results as a basis for what counts? It's a very technical question.
I mean, she's right. So GAP 4 is not protected. It's not protected with biodiversity as the primary purpose of the land, I think is how it's defined. And there are a lot of currently coded, this is super technical, GAP 4 lands that we don't actually know what the management is. And in California, one of our initial goals was to say, if you're in GAP 4, but you think, or you're not on our map as protected, but you think you should be, come talk to us because we want to actually fix your map. So a lot of those places, and this is particularly true for working lands, there are a lot of working land easements that are in fact very good for biodiversity, but they're not actually cataloged well in our system. And that's true for regional open spaces as well. For whatever reason, they haven't been pulled into our data systems. And so they land in this no man's land of GAP 4, but that's not really accurate. So we're working to improve that. And I'm hoping through time, we will actually see our numbers go up just because we capture all those places that are currently not properly mapped.
Okay, how about from the audience here? Get the mic and bring it over right here. Over there.
Oh, you got to turn on.
Thank you. I'm Joanna Nelson. I'm wondering about the attention paid to synergies across land and water, coastal ocean. That's one thing. And then Holly, thanks for saying we need to talk about carbon emissions, right? We have IPCC reports, we have special report 1.5 degrees C, and either in those or elsewhere, where are we talking about this is what ecosystems can do and conservation, this is what we can do for biodiversity if the rest of society is working on lowered carbon emissions and keeping life temperatures, right? Like I can tend land and coastal water all I want and lose it to climate disruption. So I'm wondering who's going back and forth between if you do this in the transportation sector or right across sectors, where do we Where do we have that conversation?
So sort of a cross-sector coordination amongst all these different entities that are working on sort of pieces of the big puzzle.
I think that's a great question. And California's actually been pretty good in that regard of trying to look at the problem of climate change from a whole bunch of different perspectives. I don't know, and well, Jen, you would know better than I, that they've literally had the conversation, if you do X, then I can do Y. But if you don't get to X, then I can only do Y minus 10, you know? But that's a really interesting question. What exactly is the opportunity cost for conservation of not meeting some of our other targets?
I mean, I'm not the climate expert. We have plenty of other people that do that, but California is trying to integrate that information. So our scoping plan is looking to bring together all the different sectors. So zero emission vehicles, smokestacks, and then natural and working lands. And how do we sum those up into achieving carbon neutrality, which is our statewide goal? So there's that, and I think that's coming out soon if it's not out now. And then we have a state adaptation strategy, which is sort of on the flip side, which is as we continue to not meet those targets globally, how do we prepare ourselves for the future? So how do we address sea level rise? And using our natural and working lands is a big part of that equation, right? We need things like wetlands to buffer us against sea level rise. We don't want to just build a whole bunch of concrete walls. We're better off if we have natural systems that do that. It's also thinking about how our forests are going to respond. All that work is within this sector. And there's actually another strategy, the Natural and Working Lands Climate Smart Strategy, that identifies all the different actions we can take to sort of build resilience and use our lands to sequester carbon. So within the Resources Agency, we have Access for All, we've got our climate smart work, and then 30 by 30, which sort of sits at the nexus of those, which is where we really think about protecting lands in a durable way for the long term for biodiversity. Hope that's helpful.
I think there was a point also on the link between marine and terrestrial, and just to give an example, for example, in France, marine natural parks can have a say on the activities on land that could have an impact on their, on biodiversity. So that's not perfect, of course, but that may be one way to make sure protected areas have a say on other realm that are not directly theirs.
I would like to add something. It's not really related to the question, but part of it. Well, in 2019, there were a very big report published by the scientific community within IPBES, which is the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. And they analyze a lot of scientific publication. And they ended with a very big report, which is 1,800 pages, but you are very lucky in this room because it's in English, easier for you. But I read most of the part of this report, and IPBES say that there are 5 main pressure on biodiversity. Climate change, of course, but it's not the first one for biodiversity. Actually, it's the third one. And the first one for biodiversity in land, it's land use change. And land use change, it's, for example, you transform a forest into a crop field. And the land use change is mostly, the activity which is mostly responsible for the land use change is agriculture, and then our food. So if you want to protect biodiversity, you must think of what you are eating. And if you are eating something that destroys biodiversity over there in another land, the second pressure is the catch of biomass, so fisheries or wood cutting. And the third pressure is climate change, and the fourth pressure is pollution of all ecosystem with pesticides or chemical pollution. Or plastic pollution, especially in the marine protected areas. And the fifth pressure is invasive species. So I think when we we speak about biodiversity loss, we have to keep in mind those five pressures.
I think we share those. Can I bring the mic over? Who's got the mic now? Right over here? Oh, okay, got it. Good.
There we go. Oh, yeah. I wanted to ask about water for sustaining the biodiversity on land, right? Obviously, you've talked about the need for these land environments, whether it's for plants or animals, to be self-sustaining, and we don't have enough water to make that happen. So my question is actually very specific, but all of you, if you had the opportunity to walk into Silicon Valley or into the high-tech hub in Grenoble, and you could pick one water technology you wanted us to work on, what would you say? I know there's so much out there. Maybe it's making clouds, force them to drop more rain, or desalinating ocean water, or recycling wastewater, or actually on a policy level, forcing every toilet in California to have a dual flush. We don't even do that, which is backwards. But so if you could do one thing, I know there's lots, but I'm really curious to hear what you would pick.
So I would go really super low tech. And I would say, let's meter actual water use from our farms as well as our cities. We actually have gotten, when I moved to California, I actually live in Davis, which is on the edge of the Central Valley. And at that time, a whole bunch of Central Valley cities didn't meter water. We still don't. Yeah, I mean, it's now the law that you have to. That had to be imposed because it's been a matter of pride. We have enough water. You know, we don't have to worry about that. So super low tech, let's just track who is using what water as a start, because you can't control it unless you know a little bit about it.
Okay. Any comment before we go back to this room? Any other comments from the live audience? Jean-Baptiste? Yeah. We'll go back and forth between the two. Okay.
Yeah. One more question for the chat from Alicia. When I was a kid, Commander Cousteau took me virtually to the ocean, and I fell in love with the biodiversity I encountered, as well as deciding French people were very cool. I'm not making this up, it's really written. Are there opportunities that arise from international connections that we have yet to tap? Do any come to mind to the panelists? Open the bracket, a bit of brainstorming maybe. That's it.
Yeah, could maybe you rephrase that? I'm not sure we got quite the question.
Yeah, I think the idea is what example we could gather from other countries. Like in some other places, in some other countries, they have given, I don't know if it's the right term, but like personality to some ecosystems, like a river, like a forest. That can be an example. I don't know if countries like France would be ready to go in that direction, but that could be something interesting. Or other countries like Costa Rica, who shifted from extractive industries and putting biodiversity really at the core, I mean, biodiversity or nature or conservation at the core of their development. So it's something that we could learn lessons from.
Go ahead.
I feel like I would be remiss if I didn't mention, you know, all the amazing conversations we had with California Native American tribes as we did this work. So that's another country within our country, right? Or many. And one thing I really took away from those conversations was just the mindset that we need to get more in ourselves, right? Which is that we are actually part of this ecosystem, and this ecosystem is part of us. And there's not a separation that is nature's over there, we're over here. And I think about 30 by 30 sometimes, and we're talking about 30% for all the biodiversity on the planet and 70% for one species is kind of how we're framing it, which is not great. And I would say that, you know, the tribal nations say that that's not the right framing. You know, that nature is part of who we are and how we live our lives. And if we can So that to me is a powerful example. I can't articulate it well, but it's a key sort of shifting. So when we use the word nature, that doesn't mean something other than humans. And I think we would do well to remember that.
Yeah, I think the World Protected Area community is there to learn from each other. And I think in particular, the United States has struggled with this history, legacy with indigenous people. And our model of protected areas, which sort of originated with the concept of national parks, was imposed on unoccupied lands that had been depopulated by force. When that model was sent out around the world and it had to be adapted to incorporate indigenous culture, knowledge, stewardship, tradition, and activities in a way embedded within the protected area model. And I think we're relearning that here in the United States from other nations that have recognized that this is integral to the future of stewardship and to the future of the planet. So I think this is absolutely spot on. So I think we had a question here in the audience, or did anybody want to comment on that?
Yes, I just would add that it is as well a major result of IPBES that show that when the land is managed by indigenous people and local community, most of the time biodiversity is well conserved, and that we should probably include more those community into international discussion, for example, or even in research, because they have some knowledge that is very valuable.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I have a question about the way we're gonna sell this plan. Let me phrase that better. We are in a world where everything becomes politicized, everything is a debate. This is a great idea, it's clear for everybody. But we know that we are going to have opposition, maybe in the US, maybe in Europe and elsewhere. So my question is, how are we going to avoid this to become the same as climate change? How are we going to make sure that the majority of people are on board on this? And when I say the majority, is majority in every country and every country and everybody in each country.
Okay.
I don't know if that's the solution, but if we manage to make people understand that nature doesn't need us, but that we need nature, then we would have made a great step, because, I mean, biodiversity will survive after us, even if there is a nuclear war or whatever, there will still be biodiversity after. So that's not the purpose. The purpose is to protect biodiversity for, I mean, if we as humans want to keep a certain level of way of life. So maybe that could be a way if we manage to make people understand that.
Yeah, I think from my position, part of it is reframing the question into different sort of value sets, that we've sort of sold it on the biodiversity, which doesn't necessarily resonate with everyone. But public health, there's a great body of science out there, international, around the value of having access to nature for your own personal health. And so it is a essentially almost free antidote to depression, to heart disease, to obesity, to a whole range of ailments that we all face. And we can sell it on the idea of economics. Helen talked about the economic value of conserving these areas. We can sell it on the social and cultural value that it brings communities together. And I think we unfortunately have a tendency to talk to ourselves about it in sort of single terms. And I think we really have to broaden that in order to really resonate more broadly with the public. Do we have another question from online? Anything on chat? Okay, here.
Hi, my name's Steve Montfort. Congratulations to France for hitting your 30% numbers already. That's great. it seems that California is well on track to achieve the same thing. I guess my question relates to some of the terms that we use. We talk about protected areas, which implies that we're putting up fences and we're keeping everything inside protected and static. And yet we also use terms like natural and working lands, land and seascapes. But in reality, biodiversity lands are also working lands, and they don't function being left alone. And so they need our help and management. So I wonder, once we've achieved 30 by 30, will there be the momentum to continue forward with the management of these resources so they continue to provide the ecosystem services we need? Because we know if we just leave them alone, pressure from the the mosaic that they're in and so on, they're likely to the services are likely to be decremented from that.
It's a good question.
I mean, absolutely, and I should say that these areas are protected in the context of something else in a way, right? So when we establish a national park or a wildlife refuge, or we identify a conservation easement for endangered species, like there's a whole universe of requirements that go into creating that place. So in California, we're trying to rely on some of those other systems that already do that conservation for our counting, right? So we say, if you're doing everything to get to that you meet our conditions for being part of a conserved area. And within that context, some of those places have some good management plans in place, and they have resources for long-term management, and some do not. So that is absolutely a piece of the puzzle, is making sure that we have the resources in the long term to steward those places. It's not just enough to move it from column A to column B and walk away, but a lot of them do have the management that they need, and a lot do not. And so part of our document does outline that stewardship, long-term management, adaptive management and monitoring, those are all key pieces, because otherwise you won't know if you're achieving what you've set out to do.
I know France in particular, in my work around the world, has been very effective at achieving the green list for a number of your protected areas, which is really a measure of effectiveness of achieving your goals. You want to talk about that? Because that provides us a set of durability.
Yeah, so, and that's also, we have put that in our strategy for protected areas to make sure that the protected areas get more financial sustainability, and as I mentioned before, that they get more integrated in their territory. So that's two aspects to make sure that they get more better protected. And that relates also to because we spoke about international before. Another aspect that is discussed nowadays, I mean, currently in Geneva, around the CBD, is how we need also to help other countries to protect their biodiversity, because US and France may have means to, normally they should have means to protect their biodiversity, to set protected areas and to pay rangers and to pay the fuel for the cars and etc. But in many countries, they don't have even the money to, to put the gas in the tank and go with the car. So we also need to have that in mind, but that's another subject.
Yeah, it makes a very good point that less than 10% of the protected areas around the world are effectively managed, predominantly because they are severely underfunded and understaffed to achieve those goals. Any other comments or questions?
There is a question for the chat from Stu Weiss. So here is a question. Ensuring long-term stewardship is the key to maintaining biodiversity. We need a manifold increase in guaranteed resources for monitoring and taking care of the lands and water. How do we get there?
That's an awesome question. And actually that highlights one of the shortfalls of doing this work by executive order rather than through legislation, because the legislatures control the purse. The executive can often move, in our system, can often move money around from the pots that they already have, but they can't make new money appear in the way that the legislature can. So in terms of long-term funding, I think we're going to need legislation. If I could just add two things about the robust long-term management. I think it's true that we need some management in a lot of these places. Given the pace of change and in some ways the unpredictability of change, I actually think we need to think about robust and long-term in somewhat different ways than we have in the past. Having a set of lands that we think forever is going to preserve what we want, that may not be the right way to think about it at this point. And managing to keep what's already there, there are some places where that's hugely important to us, and we don't want to necessarily let that go. But I also think we need to manage to allow nature to change in its own ways in at least some places.
Yes, I totally agree with that, because when you look at ecosystem services, there are almost 20. And when you speak about management, you probably speak about productivity of the land, for example, agro-system, when you would like to produce food or timber or other materials. And those ecosystem services are increasing because we are putting a lot of money on energy on them. So they are increasing. But all the other are decreasing. That is to say, pollination, the soil fertility, the water purification, the water quantity, the air purification, the climate change, the dramatic events, and even the disease and the way that ecosystem can prevent the disease to spread into domestic animals or humans. So I totally agree. We will need a more holistic approach to what nature is able to do for us. And I could perhaps quote a publication that was published in 2018. And the researcher tried to model the future of humanity in a few centuries. And if we lack to protect nature, unfortunately, in almost all of the pathways, humanity is declining. Because we will be in a world where there will be enough food for everyone. And we are talking at about 10 billion people, enough food for 10 billion people, but not enough quality of nature to survive. That is to say, the air will be very polluted, the water will be very polluted, we will be forced to compensate with technology, and IPBES has shown that technology won't compensate all of ecosystem services. So it's very important to think of all that and try to, yes, perhaps let nature do itself what she has done for a very long time.
Anna, you get the last question.
Well, thank you so much, John. My question is for our guests from France, and I had the pleasure to visit your country, beautiful country, and I was very struck by the diversity, the racial diversity in Paris. And understanding the history of France when you had territories in North Africa, and you have such a large populations of newly arrived immigrants and new citizens of France that live in marginalized communities within France. As you look at the biodiversity and connecting people with nature, can you share with us anything that has worked for you, that has really been meaningful and relevant, that we can learn from you? Or is equity and reaching to people in marginalized communities has not been a part of the policy framework as we think about how do we protect nature?
I don't know if it's a good example, but it's an example that, I mean, some people may have in mind. I don't know if you may have seen on your screens the yellow jacket in France, the protest. For me, it's I mean, it's one example. There may be a lot of reasons, but we try to, so it's more related to climate change, but we try to increase the taxes on gas. I mean, the government tried to do that because it was seen as a way, of course, to get more money, but also to send a strong signal that we could not go and use always the same amount of gas. And I think one of the reasons why it created the protests and why people did not accept it, it was maybe because it wasn't seen as equitable. Because on the other hand, people could still use very cheap airplanes. I mean, could go on airplanes very cheaply because there was subsidies given to air companies. And maybe other part of the society didn't get the same burden. And it's always the same question. I mean, if you raise the price, for example, super rich people won't be very affected because it's, I mean, they will always have the means to pay for their gas. So I think, I hope we learn from that in France and maybe in other countries, that any transition, and we need to have a huge transition if we want to change our models, it will really need to be more equitable than what we have done so far.
Good. Helen, did you want to add to that? Good.
Well, I think some towns in France are now fully aware that there is a problem with social equity and access to nature for poor population. And I think, for example, the town of Saint-Denis, which is in the north of Paris, is trying to rethink their town management plan, especially for housing for low-income population, in order to put this this building not far away from a park or a green space. So I would say we made the diagnosis. So now I think everybody is aware that we have to do something, and we are waiting for the results.
I would like each of the panelists maybe to make a final comment or two about your thoughts on this opportunity, one, to work together with our nations, but also to achieve this broad, extraordinary goal. So, Cyril, why don't you start at your end?
Yeah, first, I mean, it was very useful to prepare this discussion and to have it, I guess, for me and for my agency, I hope. And I would say that 30 by 30, I hope, is just the first step, and maybe there will be 50 by 50, and maybe more after. That's my wish.
Yeah, this has been fun and exciting, and it's been an opportunity to learn about how things are done elsewhere, which sometimes in the United States we have a tendency not to pay enough attention to that kind of thing. So it's definitely good for us. I think 30 by 30 is an incredibly exciting opportunity to get people thinking and talking again about conservation and why it's important to us and how we should do it and how much we should do it. And I think the what Jen said about the perspective, 30% for the rest of everything and 70% for us, that's maybe is not exactly the right framing. So maybe we'll gradually move a little farther.
So I would say that, yes, it's a question of protection of biodiversity, but it's always is as well a question of involving everyone in this pathway. And I am very happy to see that we can do some talks like that and to share our experiences about the biodiversity protection. And I would be very agree with Cyril to say that, yes, 30 by 30, it's just the first step, and we will have to go forward, perhaps 50 by 50, but perhaps 100 by 50.
Well, this has been wonderful for me as well. And I think of 30 by 30 as a way to get the conversation going, but also to see all the work we do in the context of a larger story. And there's a lot of good conservation going on, but when you start to aggregate it in your mind and think about, can we get to 30% if we work together? That's exciting. And I think thinking about it across the country and then thinking about it across the globe, you start to really see that we're all part of something really important, and we have allies across the globe that care. And I think that's inspiring, and we need hope in a time where there's a lot of bad things going on. And so this has been good for me to be part of this, and I hope we keep talking.
So thank you. Thank you, Autodesk. Thank you, Jean-Baptiste. Thank you, the audience here. Thank you that are out there watching online. Please give a round of applause to this great panel.